Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm Heather Burnt-Santy, and I've got Dan Hodgins again.
Hey, thanks, Heather.
Miraculously, Dan Hodgins keeps agreeing to be on my podcast. So thank you. Welcome. I emailed Dan a few weeks ago with a question that I thought I really wanted to hear his opinion on, and I thought if I want to hear it, probably everyone else does too. So here we go. But I'm going to start with a quote, and then we'll jump in. But so this is from Francis Wardle's book, Oh Boy, Teaching Strategies for something. I don't remember the subtitle. Yikes. But it's Oh Boy by Francis Wardle.
Yes.
And he was on the show a few weeks ago. But anyway, he writes, there's no research or theory in the vast early childhood body of knowledge that supports the view that children can only learn while sitting down quietly. In fact, there is growing research that suggests movement is positively associated with learning. Children need to be encouraged to move throughout the day, both indoors and outdoors, and this movement needs to be viewed as a very positive learning process, as opposed to an impediment to learning or something that needs to be controlled, which is kind of where we started to go before I hit record and I made you stop. So this came up for me because I have some friends who are parents who are their children are starting online kindergarten, and the parents are very worried because it's hard for their children to sit still and attend to online kindergarten. So they wanted some ideas for fidgeting kinds of toys. And what I sent them instead were ideas for big body movement breaks. So, just the idea that a fidget toy might really help one child, but it can't be the only answer if a child is telling you that they need to move their bodies rather than be sitting in front of that screen. So I wanted to hear your thoughts, Dan, on fidget toys in general, movement in general,
Yeah, I think
learning.
the challenge of fidget toys to me implies that I want to control your movement in some way to make it easier for me as the adult to handle it. I understand, especially with parents and children being at home, and the world is really different now. But so therefore, I think sometimes we look for things that might make it easier for us as adults rather than looking at what the child really needs. So
Yeah.
part of my concern about the whole fidget toy thing is that, maybe if we had this, we can stop the child from being so active.
Mm-hmm.
And the real issue to me, Heather, isn't fidgeting. It's what children are good at versus what they might not be good at. So if you're really good at fidgeting, then my role as an adult, a parent, a teacher, is to make sure that I have things available for that child to be good at what they are good at, which is fidgeting. We almost believe that fidgeting is a bad thing, when perhaps it's not bad at all. It's just the way the child needs to move and grasp. I know for my own self, putting me on an airplane for a long trip, you would not want to sit next to me because I want to get up. It's hard for me to sit still for very long. So if it's that difficult for adults, you can imagine, what it might be for children too.
Yeah. I think, of course, anytime we can tie it to how an adult feels or an adult's experience, I think that's really helpful. And it always reminds me of 2 years ago when I hurt my knee. I couldn't cross my legs during meetings. And just that I was constantly aware of the fact that that was my comfort position and that's what I needed to do. And so I was not focused, even though I was sitting still.
Right.
And looking like I was focused. My mind was only thinking about how much control it was taking to sit that way. That was so uncomfortable. So I think about that a lot, whenever we're talking about asking children to sit for longer than they're able to, or that they just don't want to. It's interesting. You talked about fidgeting in two different ways there. And I think my view of an individual child is going to determine, me as a teacher in general, will determine what I think about fidgeting. Like if it's a child who I know that if I hassle them enough, I can get them to sit still, then fidgeting is a misbehavior. And, or if, I feel like it's disrupting the group, I see it as a misbehavior that I need to try and stop. If sometimes if the child has a diagnosis, or like a behavior plan, then we see fidgeting as something we're doing to try and control that
Yes.
behavior. So it just is interesting to me, the many ways that we view it and the reasons we suddenly find that it's okay, when
Right.
in this other situation we would be really annoyed by it.
And that's what I meant by whether or not we view fidgeting as something the child is good at
Uh-huh.
versus something the child is bad at.
Uh-huh.
Because if we view fidgeting or being active as bad, then we're probably going to get more challenging behaviors
Mm-hmm.
because the child needs to demonstrate how good they are at it.
Right.
So I'm always thinking about, okay, let's say we're in a classroom where, or even at home, if they're looking at a computer screen and they're sitting in a chair, I think the chair invites children to fidget, especially if they're an active child, because it takes a conscious effort for children to sit down. It's not an unconscious. For
Mm-hmm.
children, it's a conscious effort to sit down. And during that time, they're going to move their chair, they're going to move it back and forth, they're going to do all kinds of things. And then we view that as, why can't you sit still?
Right.
And
Yeah.
yet the chair is giving the opposite view to the child. Maybe I could stand in it, maybe I could get underneath it, maybe I could push it,
Right.
all those components that are really natural.
Yeah. Look at all these opportunities you've presented me with by giving me this chair.
Right. So sometimes we actually invite children to fidget without even thinking about it. I'm always thinking, when I go visit programs, the active child has a really hard time sitting down for snack, for
Mm-hmm.
example. And I'm a believer that, why do you have to sit down to eat? Now, I understand if you have a toddler, it's a way to corral them. But if we're talking about children in general, is it perhaps more productive for the child if they actually got to stand up?
Yeah.
Eat. I call that happy hour eating. It's what adults do sometimes when they go out to have a drink,
Yeah.
whatever. They stand up at the stand-up table
Uh-huh.
and eat. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, nobody's scolding them for doing
Yeah.
that behavior. So I think sometimes our approach encourages or discourages what I think is natural behavior for children.
Yeah. And I think it's another example of, I talk a lot about euphemisms that we use in the field when one sort of practice is, suddenly discouraged or sort of falls out of favor. We sometimes only change the language, but don't really change our expectations or what we're doing with children. And I think that movement and fidgeting falls in that category for me, because it's not always seeing the need. We say, oh, we're meeting their need to move, but what we're really meeting is our need to have children under control. And so we'll allow this little treat of movement as, sort of a bargain, a deal that we're making. But it's really still about me and my needs as, if I'm a teacher who sees whole body listening. I just learned that was a thing that people expect from children, where you're sitting and you're looking at and your hands are still and your legs are a certain way and you're looking at the person who's teaching you, and that's whole body learning, and it's not.
It's like the concept that we often talk about is that crisscross applesauce or pretzel movement implies I want control of you. At the same time, they classify it as, well, the only way children can learn is if they're sitting still and paying attention to what I have to say. Whether it's relevant or not doesn't matter.
Right.
That I need that opportunity. They call it the teaching moments. Seem to be those movements or moments when children are paying attention
Yeah.
to me rather than us paying attention to what they need.
Right. And I think that's kind of what Francis Wardle was saying in the quote that I used at the beginning, is that we let, we give them a little bit of movement, but the goal is still to get them into this large group, sit still. We think that the little 2 minutes of Simon Says that we do meets that movement need enough, but really they're learning while they're doing all those big body movements that they need. That should be seen as a positive thing, not something we have to fix, not a deficit.
Yeah. And when I talk with teachers, they frequently talk about children who run a lot,
Yeah.
Who jump a lot, who move a lot, as a child who needs some sort of control, versus the child who has learned to pay attention to what the teacher wants and therefore does it by sitting still. Those kinds of behaviors as being the child I like better than the child
Definitely.
who fidgets or moves. Calling the prancing child who the boy who holds onto his penis and jumps around.
Prances, yeah.
That's the prancing child. It's also a hip hop artist.
Yes.
Those kind of components.
Yes, I've also heard that framed as I'm working with early childhood teachers as, well, that's a distraction for the children who want to learn, as if sitting quietly is automatically a sign that you are interested and learning and tuned in, and maybe not just a different personality style or a child who's sort of learned by trial and error that it's less painful to just sit and get through this to get to the next thing that I want to do. And that's so unfair. In fact, I posted something on my Facebook page about that whole body listening. It was like just a meme about how we should get rid of it. And a lot of the comments were, but it's such a distraction for the other children. And I thought, well, if you're doing something and half the children can't sit still for it and the other half are distracted by that, then you should think of a different way to do it. I mean, that's your responsibility as a teacher and as a professional, is to collect that data that the children are giving you and work on solving the problem.
Right, and that's what I meant at the beginning. If you notice the child is really good at fidgeting, then it's my job as a teacher to look at how to give that child more opportunity to fidget.
Right.
And to
because it's what he deserves, not because we get control
in terms of that component. And whether or not it's distracting or not, I think probably it's more distracting for the adult who's interested in teaching in a way that might suggest the only way that learning can take place is if I pour out information.
Sure. And in an online learning setting, what choices do we have? Like that's
yeah. So I always, even with power struggles, I'm always looking at, most of those can diminish the more activity that we have for children, especially if it's full body energy kinds of experiences. So I often look at how often does a child who really needs more activity get to do that in some way indoors. I think we're better at it outdoors, although I'm really concerned that we're even starting to control that now.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yes.
We start certifying outdoor playground equipment and making it less safe.
Right. And talking about taking the classroom outdoors, and suddenly you have dramatic play outdoors, which really lends itself to being still, even though you are out there.
Yeah.
Where typically you would be doing more movement or painting. Not that that's wrong. If children want to do that outside, that's one thing, but just being intentional about it, because also you're taking away sometimes the one opportunity that they have to really move and run and yell and the things that they need to do sometimes.
And have control of what they need. I think part of the whole idea of why fidgeting can be distracting, is what adults say, is we're not really giving children the opportunity to choose what they need in terms of their energy levels. And it's going to be different for different people. Some children can sit for a long time at a task that they're really interested in, or somebody else might be a floater. in terms of
Yeah.
their development. And one is not better than the other. They're just different in terms of their needs.
Yeah.
And if we give children the opportunity to control that, it becomes less, quote, distracting.
Yeah. Yeah, we in my class the last year in my preschool class had one we do like a story time in the morning, and we sing and we read a book and we talk, and maybe 10 minutes depending on their interest. And one little guy just needed to be circling the room that whole time, and he would just be walking around, but he was listening. He could contribute to
Yeah,
the story. He would come over and talk about the song and then go back to wandering.
right.
And nobody else cared. The other kids were right there, and that's fine. But I had a grad student then say, well, why does he get to do that when no one else does? And I said, because he's the one who's showing me that he needs to do that. So if the other kids needed to do that, we'd be talking about ways to make it okay for them to do it too. But none of them have expressed that need, so they're hanging out over here with us, and he's doing his laps, and it's all okay.
Right, right. And plus the fact, if you've got a child who's saying, teacher, he's standing up and pushing me, well, you might want to get closer to me then.
Sure. Yeah.
Rather than saying, well, Jason, stop doing that. Can't you hear what Carl is saying? You might want to get closer to me because he really needs to move right now.
Uh-huh.
It's more receptive. It invites that it's okay
Mm-hmm.
To be active, because that's my big concern, is we're giving the message that it's not okay to be active.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we don't want to do that because one is not better than the other. Again. It's just
One may be easier for us, but it's not better. Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether or not we think it's easier, but in reality, if we're trying to control a child's movement, it's like saying, I'm going to stop you from running down the hallway, even though the hallway says, run, 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 thing, where the other child is screaming, teacher, he's running. Well, I see that. Let's get up to him.
Let's get him. Yeah.
It's a different attitude.
Yeah.
And,
and it sends a different message to the group. Because if one child says he's moving too much and it's bothering me or whatever, and we correct that child, everyone in that room is receiving that message, not just the child that we're correcting. But if instead we say, well, I wonder what you could do, maybe come stand by me, then we're sending them more of a accepting, problem solving, positivity about difference message to the whole whole group. I had one time one of the boys, I think he was 4 at the time, was just that, he's in my space, he's touching me, whatever. And I said, well, you could move. And he literally said, I can do that. Like it had never occurred to him that he could take care of that problem.
Yeah. And what a good way to suggest to the group, the community of children, you can have some control of this. You can actually move.
He was just like, oh, his mind was blown. This option he'd never been given before.
I had a child who took the beads and string, and it happened to be a boy, so he turned it in, not that all boys do this, but he turned it into a helicopter. For girls, when they bead and string, make necklaces sometimes.
Right, yes, or snakes.
And so he started twirling it like a helicopter, and one of the girls said, he's gonna hurt me. And I said, you could move away from his helicopter if you want to, because right now he's a spinning.
Yes. Yeah. I think movement is one of the biggest ways that we sort of stigmatize a child at an early age. Even in infancy, if it's a baby who crawls over other babies, we've already got them labeled as aggressive and a bully, and they're just practicing their movement and learning about their bodies in space. And
absolutely. I had a toddler once stand on a toddler's head who was playing on the floor to look out the window. And the mom saw that, and I said, I'm going to help him find something. But again, that's the other thing with active children. I don't know if you notice this, Heather. Active children frequently don't notice what's around them.
Yeah.
Because their interest is not who was around me.
Right.
Their interest is in the doing part. And so sometimes they might knock over a child as they're running, and it's not because they're mean,
Right.
it's because they don't see the child.
Right.
They're moving so fast. So I'm often yelling, get out of his way, he's coming fast.
Here he comes, everybody scatter.
Which supports both the active child and the child who is not as active.
Yeah. And we're not letting, one kid win or
Right.
get his way. We're understanding development. And so even though, I've heard some people when that child is running and knocks somebody else over say, things like, well, he's just so selfish. He just doesn't see anything but himself. Well, that's part of his development or her development right now. That's their need and that's what they're practicing.
Yes.
And if we give them those experiences, they might eventually learn about their bodies moving through a group. But if we don't, and they don't get a chance to practice that, then it's less likely that they're going to start having that perspective when we, feel like they should.
True. And again, we don't want to get the image. We keep bringing this up that one is better than the other.
Yeah.
I think going back to the original situation that if children are looking at a computer and they're watching classroom experiences, whatever, there is an invitation there to move, because after a while, it's just not possible for them to, we're saying that about 20 minutes is all an adult can handle.
Yeah.
Imagine how, limiting it must be for children. So I'm worried about what this is saying to children in terms of component. So we're really going to need to give more breaks for children, the possibility of standing up rather than sitting down.
Yeah.
One parent uses a pillowcase and the child actually stands in the pillowcase and hops. Like thinking, it kind of gives him some boundaries,
right.
But at the same time doesn't say he can't move.
Yeah.
Right. So some of the home situations are a little more challenging.
Right. And I know that the teachers have some limitations in how they can present it, but at the end of the day, if our goal is teaching, or we hope that the child has learned something, we can't do that while ignoring developmental realities.
Absolutely. And actually, it's just the opposite, because if we're expecting a child not to follow through with what they need, learning is going to be diminished rather than increased.
Right.
Because we know that movement, like Francis Ward said, movement actually increases cognition. And we have enough research to indicate that. So to stop a child from moving would mean he will be less prepared for the world.
Yep. If we want to talk about readiness, we got to talk about movement.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because when people talk about readiness, it's never talked about in terms of movement. It's talked about,
readiness for sitting still. Exactly. Is what we're talking about.
All those activities that cause a child to sit still.
Yep. I have to write this note down.
I think the other part of this is whether or not a child needs more, not only the activity, but maybe an experience that's more relevant to the child. Because the relevancy of an activity would decide sometimes the movement of the experience. Because I've seen children sit and do things with active materials for quite a long time. Right. In some cases. At the same time, that child might need to run frequently too, but it doesn't mean that child can't sit. It just means that it depends on what the experience is, whether or not it's relevant to them.
Right. When my son was in childcare and he was probably 3 or 4, they wanted to talk to me about their concerns about his fine motor development because he wouldn't sit and do the, written worksheet or whatever. But he would stay at a sensory table for an hour if you'd let him.
Perfect.
And, manipulating things and figuring out, how to use his hands and wrists and fingers to meet those goals that he had for himself, because that was relevant to his interests and his experience. But it did, and I think that's the case with a lot of movement conversation is, and paying attention conversations. It's and we talked about this, actually, a podcast that's coming out this week, Dan. We talked about the need to, or the fact that sometimes these problems that we see in children are not problems in the child. They're problems because they're not doing what we want them to do.
Right.
When we want them to do it. And so we pathologize the child, but really it's our expectation that we need to. That was a long, crooked way of getting there, but that's where I'm going, is that it's like so many things. We have to stop and think about our own practice, our own goals, our own implementation before we automatically assume that a child needs a fidget toy to get through this.
Right. It's interesting to me because as adults, we can go to a concert and watch people bounce all over the stage and not at all say, why don't they slow down? Why don't they be less fidgety? We're jumping with them, or we're singing with them, or whatever. Yeah. We seem to tolerate that much better than we do children who jump around and make a lot of movement experiences. And I think that's an important part of that, because the most difficult person to change, of course, is the adult.
Yes.
Because we think it's easier to change the child.
And we think it's our job to change the child. Exactly. Like, that's our view of teaching sometimes.
Yes.
Finding what they do wrong and changing it.
Yeah. And I think people come out of college sometimes thinking the only way I could teach is to make sure that I have control of the situation, and the situation usually is the child.
Yeah. I'm teaching a curriculum in early childhood class this semester, and I think they might be a little bit confused because our first essentially 4 weeks of work have been talking about relationships and talking about expectations and talking about things that aren't, necessarily lesson plan activities and what they think of as curriculum. But we're sort of setting the foundation that you can't plan curriculum until you understand this other stuff.
I totally agree with that. And if you got the child is fidgeting, you can't really help fidgeting unless you realize the need that he or she has in terms of their own development. And yet adults typically want to move right into changing and stopping essentially the activity or the active experience.
It's right there in the word activity. Active is right there in the word.
Right.
We're planning activities. We've got to have some action in there. Well, what are your parting thoughts? What's your last word of advice, Dan, for people who are wondering about the many directions?
Most endings, Heather, and I'm sure people get tired of it, but you really need to take a look at what a child is good at.
Yep.
And support what they're good at. So if they're really good at being active, then take a look at what I need to provide to make sure that he or she has that opportunity to be active rather than deactivate the child.
Yeah, because that sends a powerful message, which improves relationship, which improves all our other efforts with young children. If we can establish from the beginning, or as soon as we can, or as soon as we see the need to, that we're there, we're on your side, we see you as a competent person, we're going to meet your needs, then that's going to, if we actually do need them, then at some point to sit and listen and whatever, they're going to be more likely to do that because we've established this and given them ways to meet, to be good at.
The other thing too is getting kids ready for kindergarten. The implication is he's going to need to learn to slow down. Well, I think my responsibility is help the parents stand up for the child's activity level. And so I'm often saying, say to the teacher, how can I help you get over it? Because I think that's a more supportive for children than it is, okay, we're going to practice not moving as much. And that creates whole dilemmas for children and families.
Yeah, lots of stress for families.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, this was great, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having a good topic.
Always welcome. All right. And thanks everybody else for listening. And I know you probably enjoyed listening to Dan as much as I did. And come back next week for a new episode. Bye, everybody.